Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's presentation, Data Cataloging with Knowledge Graphs. Our speakers today are Top Quadrant's CEO and co-founder, Irene Polikoff, and Chief Marketing Officer and co-founder, Robert Coyne. Before we get started, let's review a few logistical items. Please feel free to ask questions as we go along by using your GoToWebinar controls. To post questions, please look on the right-hand side control panel. You should see a drop-down box for questions. If you click on the box, you should be able to post your question at any time during the day's presentation. We will address as many questions as time allows at the conclusion of the webinar. We'll also be recording the webinar and we'll send a link to the recorded version as well as to these slides. And with that, I'll hand it over to Robert to get us started. Robert.
Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us, and thanks, Christy. As some of you know who've been with us before, Top Quadrant was founded in 2001, the same year the vision of the semantic web was born. Since then, we've been engaged in applying that technology to many kinds of enterprise applications to make enterprise information meaningful. The technology has been known variously as semantic technology, semantic web link data, but more recently it's become more widely known as knowledge graph technology. Since 2015, our focus has been to provide comprehensive data governance solutions based on knowledge graphs. And of course, data governance solutions include data catalogs. Today's presenter is Irene Polikoff. She's the CEO of Top Quadrant, I think many of you know. Irene has a long career in information management and deep expertise in applying knowledge graphs to enterprise data management challenges. In fact, she and several other Top Quadrant personnel have been instrumental in helping to create and shape the standards for knowledge graphs through the W3C. So now to today's agenda. What she's going to cover today is informed by working with many industry customers over the last 20 years in many related areas such as data management, integration, and governance. She'll first do a concise overview of what are data catalogs and what they capture. Why are they becoming increasingly important? She'll then explore what public data catalogs, these are typically provided by government, and enterprises' internal data catalogs share in common. And with this understanding of what data catalogs are and who they're intended to support and be used by, she'll turn to why data catalogs require an infrastructure that's flexible, extensible, and open, and how knowledge graphs provide that kind of representation and capabilities. Irene will show, both in her presentation and demo, the importance of managing controlled vocabularies for describing and accessing data assets within data catalogs. For the demo, she'll also give an overview of data cataloging within top-rate enterprise data governance, which is based on comprehensive knowledge graph platform. Finally, we'll save some time at the end to respond to some questions. And with that, I want to turn it over to Irene for the main program.
Thank you, Robert, for the great introduction. So we're going to start with talking about what are the data catalogs. Well, simply put, a catalog is an inventory of organization's data assets. And we often today see data catalogs that focus on various data sets, but in a broader sense, it's not just data sets, it's any data source that an enterprise may have, and quite often these are substantial, rich data sources such as databases, data warehouses, etc. And there are lots of other various new sources of data in the enterprise. So the data catalog does not contain all the data in the context of a large enterprise. That just wouldn't be possible. But for each data asset that is being cataloged, it contains some descriptions of it. And when we talk about this description, we talk about the metadata. So that's what describes a data asset. The metadata can be quite rich and varied, technical, business, operational, etc. So whatever metadata is important for the consumers to understand the data source and make their decision about the use of the data source. So typically this would include some data statistics, again, to help understand the data source. It may even include some samples of the data because that's always useful. In addition to the description of each data asset, you've got some ways to access the asset itself. So often there would be a links or some APIs for access and download. Data catalogs is not something entirely new. Similar systems have been known previously under names of data dictionary, metadata registries, etc. But recently they have become very popular and have changed this name to less geekier name of a data catalog. So why have they become so popular? So the reason is twofold. From one perspective, there is more and more people in organizations that work with data, that are interested in data. So the number of data stakeholders have grown. We now have data scientists, and in general, business users often want access to data. So there is this whole broader movement towards data democratization and ease of access to data. And from another perspective, there has been explosion in the available data. So you have more interested parties, you have more data. The idea of this map of the mall, if you would, that describes data available in an enterprise, for example, becomes much more important, and that map has to be reached to serve its goals. So when you look for data that you're interested in, you would want to be able to identify it based on, who provides it, how well can I rely on it, what's in it, of course, how can I access it? And ultimately, the goal is to find the relevant data. But then beyond just finding it, it's also the ability to then use it, to interpret it, to maybe integrate it with some other data and use it for reporting, aggregation, for translation, or any other variety analysis, any other variety of needs that there are. When we talk about data catalogs, it's important to note that generally speaking, you may have come in contact with two types of data catalogs. So the public or external data catalogs are becoming increasingly available on the web, where organizations, quite often government organizations, just make their data available to public, to people, stakeholders, external to their organization, their agency. And then the internal catalogs, you're not going to come across them on the web as easily because they typically within the enterprise firewall, but they are equally popular, and they are for access to enterprise data within the organization itself. So lots of similarity, whether it's internal or external, there is lots of similar features. One difference that is becoming perhaps less of a difference now is that for the external or public catalog, there is this very strong drive towards using open standards. Open standards for APIs, open standards for describing the catalogs themselves, and open data in general. While with private catalogs, we also see that movement, but it's a little bit behind, a little bit slower than in public catalogs. So in private catalogs, we still see often proprietary systems. This is changing, and this is changing as we're going to discuss today, because there is this overall push towards openness and a need to flexibly accommodate different sources and different stakeholders. So here are some examples of the public catalogs, and we're gonna take a look at some of those examples to kind of see how a catalog would typically look like. So this is very typical. You have a list of available data assets, some description of each in this search result page, typically a name, typically a short description, maybe some additional metadata that the creators of the catalog think important to put directly on the results page. And then on the left, you have some search facets, so some ways of helping the user find the data that they're looking for. In this particular catalog, the search facets are fairly typical. This is the kind of facets that we often see. Well, it's a type of content. Now, these facets normally come from controlled vocabularies, so some kind of terminologies or taxonomies that catalog creators choose from when they assign metadata to the cataloged assets. So the content type is a typical one, and as you see, this is a fairly large catalog. Topics and tags, these are descriptive categories, and sometimes they are called themes, sometimes they could be called, different categories. It's a way to further describe data in the cataloged asset using some business terms. So using some taxonomies, some terminologies, and here we see a set of topics. Then those data assets may be about, so data about health or data about hospitals, etc. And those topics, themes, can be broad or they could be more narrow. And in this particular catalog, they've decided to use topics at the higher level and then tags with maybe more specific terms. Essentially, you could think about it as a taxonomy where topics are broader than the individual terms within that. There are categories such as formats, and you see a set of formats. And then the other two popular ones are publisher and the license. Who could, under what license can you use the data set, and who is publishing it. So fairly typical search facets here. Once you select the data set that you're interested in, you click on it to see more information, and typically you'll have a link to download it. And this additional information, of course, includes all those search categories that we've looked at before, such as a publisher, a license, etc. But it may also include some additional descriptions. Here we see that you can not just download the data set, you also see some additional information, maybe additional resources that you could look at to better understand this data, or maybe some related data. Now, this is an example of the open catalog that uses standards. So in addition to downloading the data set itself, you could also download this catalog record, this entire description, using one of the standard formats, and they're using RDF, so that's a knowledge graph standard. We'll talk about knowledge graphs shortly and why they are so important for data cataloging. Here's another example, also typical from the fiscal data. It's a Treasury, US Treasury website. You see a similar idea, a set of results, presented somewhat differently, but a lot of similarity. And then you see some search facets. In this example, we actually have a very small number of topics, just 6 topics, and then for search facets, we only have, publisher and the file type, so something that we saw before. This data is connected to time period. So time period, the fiscal period, is very important for it. So we also see date range as a facet. In general, the smaller the catalog and the more similar is the data, the smaller number of search facets you would typically have. So the previous had lots of data sets on a broader variety of topics. Here we see less topics and a smaller number of data sets and just 4 or 5 different facets for searching. And that makes sense because the larger and more diverse the catalog is, the more different ways that you need to give people ability to find this data. Now, when we drill down to this particular data set, we see some new information that is pretty common to data catalogs and very important. Namely, we see a data dictionary. So here is an additional metadata that not just describes data set as a whole, but also talks about each field in this data set. So what kind of data do I have available from it? So I've got the state name, I've got interest rate, percent, etc. And each of those data elements from the data set are described. And then there's the standard metadata with descriptions, information on how frequently it's published, and date range, which we have available as a search facet. So this data that we are looking at looks pretty tabular. So it looks like a table and just a set of information. But in reality, actually, the catalog is a graph with links of connections, which brings us to the topic of knowledge graphs and why they are so important for as a platform for catalogs, for data catalogs. So first of all, let's do a quick kind of intermission and talk about what are the knowledge graphs. Knowledge graphs represent information in any domain that you're interested in. We call it the knowledge domain, but here obviously our knowledge domain is enterprise data, so data assets in the enterprise. The way this information is represented is a graph, and what we mean by a graph that it's a network of nodes and links, and not just tables of with rows and columns. Why is it important that it is a graph? Well, one important quality of the graph is that it's flexible and extensible. So in case of data catalogs and data assets, you could have a variety of data assets, and you may capture different types of metadata depending on the data asset. You also will need the flexibility of deciding that, okay, I want to capture license information, or maybe I want to capture how often this data set is updated, who publishes it, etc. So you need to be able to add this metadata flexibly and not just add it in this graph as, okay, this data set is published by state of California, but also add the information in a graph that you are capturing publishers and that you have a controlled list of publishers from which you select this information. So not just the facts themselves, but also the underlying model of the kind of data that you are publishing, what are the possible values, etc. And graphs give you that type of extensibility, that type of flexibility, and also importantly, they give you ability to enrich the graph based on the available information. We talk about, in the context of knowledge graphs, we talk about rules, inferencing. Essentially, it is about inferring additional facts based on facts that are already available to you. And as I mentioned, open standards have been growing in importance for data catalogs, and the knowledge graphs are based on open standards from top to bottom, standards from the World Wide Web Consortium. And that allows people cross the silos, connect different knowledge graphs, and make this information available to all stakeholders in a standard way. So that's a little visual that talks about the facts that you may have in the catalog, the models describing the type of metadata you're going to capture in the catalog, and even richer models with rules that allow you to infer additional, or allow the cataloging system to infer additional facts. The knowledge graph can have different subgraphs within it. So if you think about the data catalog itself, you could think about it as one part of the knowledge graph. If you think about the controlled vocabularies of terms for, let's say, subjects or themes or formats or geographic coverage, so that you could think about it as other parts of the graph that gets this controlled vocabularies developed and maintained for use in describing the assets in a catalog. So what is captured typically in a data catalog? We saw some examples. Let's try to kind of pop it up a level and summarize it, what we typically see in data catalogs in terms of metadata. Obviously, some ways to identify a data asset. And there could be IDs, there could be names, there could be different alternative names for those data sets. There is variety of documentation, scope, purpose, description, maybe some links to additional related documents. There's stewardship information, and in a broader sense, this could be a publisher, this could be when it was last published, what its current status, contact information of responsible people, etc. Then we already saw a number of categories or aspects, topics, themes that can be used to tag the data set with. And it's a variety of subject topics, but there could also be temporal tags, as we saw with the time period in the Treasury data. There could be a geographic tags. This is data about Europe, or this is data about the state of California, etc. There could also be a social tags that has to do with users of this data set, and maybe information, how many users, maybe information about some endorsements from the users, and so on. Data access is another category of information, which includes links to download, but also a broader information about how exactly can you access it. Is there any access control? What is a license? What formats may be available to you, and so on. We saw the example of a data dictionary, and that was a fairly simple data dictionary, which just we're dealing with a spreadsheet, so just the columns in a spreadsheet, and maybe some type of data in a column, such as whether it's a string or an integer or a date. Data dictionary can contain more information as well. For, in case of databases, for example, you could have information about primary and foreign keys. You could have information about whether the value is generated, whether it could be a null, some range of values, min, max, permissible values, and so on. So that could be fairly rich. And of course, you could have a human readable description of each data element. Data samples often are part of the catalog. Sometimes they could be fairly large data samples. Sometimes they could be just small data samples, enough to understand the data. And then as we move from public catalogs and look more into the private catalogs, there's even richer amount of metadata. So traceability is often important, and by traceability we mean connection to requirements, connection to organizational processes, mappings to business terms. Data quality is another very important factor, and you could use some controlled vocabulary to describe the quality level, but you may also want to capture the quality of the data set over time. There may also need to be a way to understand the issues with the data. So the catalog also becomes a central part of the data governance processes as well, or other data governance processes are important in standing up and producing a reliable data catalog. Lineage, it talks about how the data was derived, because all data in the organization is connected, and you typically have considerable connections between the different data sources, and understanding the whole derivation map and where the data is coming from is an important factor in deciding whether you could use it. Regulatory compliance is another type of metadata that may be captured in a catalog. In a sense, it's part of the quality, part of traceability. So when we look at all of this information, hopefully it becomes clear that indeed the catalog is, and information in it is a graph of connections as shown in this diagram. So you see that the data set may be attributed with various topics or concepts. We talk about formats, licenses, we talk about data elements, we talk about the fact that the data set may belong to a group of data sets, and it can be derived from another data set, publisher, etc. And when you think about this graph in a broader sense, of course, a party publishes more than one data set, so that's, and more than one data set have a certain data types, has a certain license type, etc. So this is like a broad graph that keeps on growing as you adding data into your catalog. And quite often this different metadata here, such as format, concept, parties, periodicity, etc. Quite often the values come from controlled vocabularies, which are essential for creating a usable data catalog. And they are also managed in the same graph, where you could select values that can be used as metadata for all these different categories. Just to show you as one example, there is another kind of public data catalog in the European Union, which is a very large and substantial catalog, since it's published by many different data, and it is from many different agencies in the European Union. And they in particular have lots and lots of metadata categories or controlled vocabularies that they're using to attribute this data. So they could be some small vocabularies, such as how do you talk about periodicity of publishing a data set? So what values can you use to specify how often it gets published? What are the data themes? What are the types of data owners, type of licenses? So small and focused controlled vocabularies. Then a larger reference data set, for example, that lists the available publishers or lists the geographic scopes that are available, as well as this could be a very extensive taxonomies of terms, such as here for European Union subjects, we have a very extensive vocabulary with different topics, ranging from health to legal topics such as discrimination, food, etc. Again, because this is a very extensive catalog with very diverse data sets. So the variety of metadata and extent of metadata for such a catalog needs to be significant. With this, let me switch and show you a short demo using our product TabRate Edge, which is a data governance product, and as part of its data governance functionality, it has support for data catalogs. And I'm going to start by showing you the search screen. And this is a search page, and this is how typically a catalog user would interact with a catalog basically we see something very similar to the examples that I showed before. There are different search facets where we could, for example, look at, let's say, different topics or subjects and pick based on them or formats. And then there's a list of search results. In TopRightEdge, the search facets get automatically calculated, so it's based on the data in the catalog. The system looks at the available data and says, okay, you could use the following facets for searching, and there are more facets here. So you could talk about different temporal coverage, and you could talk about different formats and a large number of facets, because there's a large variety of different data sets. Of course, you could, instead of this kind of a calculated capability, you could also set specific facets and say, well, we only want to have these 10 facets available for search. And then for the search results, you see also a similar page where you've got some description, you have the name of the asset, you have some collaboration capabilities where you could actually endorse something that you're using, or maybe you could comment on your use of this particular data asset. There are some visualization capability as well. And the type of information that shows on the result page is also configurable. So this is a default, but if you want to see additional metadata, this would be available. And in addition to a facet-based search, there is, of course, also a keyword type of search that could work with facets to further narrow information. And then finally, when you found something that you are interested in based on what you see here, you could click on it and see more information about it. And in this particular data set, we see some additional information such as dates, download links, different formats for distribution, the contact information, publishers, topics, and categories that used to attribute it, and so on. So kind of fairly typical but automated search pages and ability to access it, which brings us to a topic of how does data actually gets into the catalog. So this is an environment that provides you access to the catalog data, but it's also an environment that provides you with cataloging APIs and stewardship processes as well. So let me go to this demo data sets from a different perspective. It's the same data sets, but now think about me switching more into the governance environment where I could control this information, edit this information, and also use that to import data sets into the catalog. And there's various import options that you could go against the database, you could use a data set. For this example, I'm going to use the data set, actually the data set from Treasury that we looked at before, and that's this spreadsheet with this state unemployment information. You see the kind of data that I have here. And if I wanted to catalog it, I'm just gonna import it through this facility. It could also be done through the API. I'm gonna choose the file, and that's my spreadsheet. And I could also choose a number of samples that I want the system to connect. If I want to collect any data samples to help me further understand it. And now a new data set has been cataloged, and whatever available information is in the data set itself is automatically added to my catalog. And in this case, the available information basically is my data dictionary. So I have some data elements. There is a technical metadata that's such as the number of records. I know that it's in CSV format. I know the file name. So this kind of metadata that can be gathered from the data set itself automatically added to the catalog. And then it could be further enriched. It could be enriched through this reasoning process that we've talked about. It could also be enriched through some kind of an editing process for me as an end user, as a steward, if you would. Let's say I wanted to give it a better name than what is available in the file itself, and I want to give it a more human readable name, or I want to add a description to it. I want to perhaps say how often it changes, so that comes from a controlled vocabulary of periodicity or frequency of change. And I could now save my changes. So now I'm playing a data steward role. The catalog has data quality control built into it. So there's something it doesn't like about my changes, but I'm going to save it anyway. And let's see what it doesn't like. Well, it doesn't like the fact that actually the publisher is required, and I didn't provide the publisher information. So I could edit it further to say who is the publisher. So there is this built-in ability to control the quality of the catalog entry. Now, if I look at this controlled vocabulary or entry in the controlled vocabulary that talks about periodicity, you see that it comes from another part of the knowledge graph where this type of values can be managed. So I have available values for describing how often the data set is published, for the type of content, and other kind of small sets of right statements types, etc., that are important to serve as a controlled metadata from my catalog. And people who may be maintaining this type of vocabularies could be different people in the organization. They could be using controlled workflows to maintain this part of the important part of the catalog that gets used to attribute the data assets. And these are small controlled vocabularies. There could be a much richer, taxonomies, let's say financial information, agriculture information. So these are the same example that I was showing from the European Union. There is quite a large taxonomy of topics that you could manage here and that you could use in your cataloging processes. As I mentioned, it's a broader data governance environment, and in addition to seeing different types of knowledge graphs that I have here, from taxonomies to reference data sets, you also see some idea of possibility of having workflows that run, of having some task assignments, having different governance roles. For example, I am, as a current user, as a business steward for some part of data here, the PR type of data. And even richer, we could look at the lineage type of information, where we could see how data is flowing from one data set to perhaps databases, etc. That kind of information and visualization is also available as part of the catalog. And Another kind of data that I have not shown in the data in this demo, but it's also important. We've mentioned the fact that we are cataloging not just data sets, but rich resources. For example, databases. So here we see a set of columns in a database, and a column is, of course, part of a table. So you've got some information about the table. And just like we could do data sampling for a spreadsheet, a data set, a data sampling can happen for a database as well. And another important aspect of the kind of information that you could get in a catalog is when you look at the specific data element. Of course, you'll get its physical data type. Maybe you get some range of values, etc. There's also a concept of permissible values. And the reason that's important is because that could both help you assess the quality of a data set. So here we have a field that obviously has to do with categories of ages. So you could say this is how we describe different age categories in our data set. So that type of information can help you assess the quality. Does it correspond to the permissible values? But it also helps you connect different data sets together. So if you have age being talked about in different data sets, they could be, through these permissible values, you could derive a connection to, let's say, a business term of age. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about it. But first, I'm going to talk about the steps for creating a data catalog. Essentially, in this demo, we kind of went through the life cycle. We look at from the user of the catalog perspective, searching through the catalog, to actually the cataloging process itself, adding something to the catalog and automatically getting some of the metadata that's available from a data set, to enriching the catalog with additional values, more like a human in the loop process. So that's kind of a mini life cycle, is the kind of life cycle that you would follow when you stand up the catalog. Of course, first you will identify your scope. What are initial data sources that you want to be inventoried? Then you will normally decide what metadata is important to you. What type of information will you collect about the assets in the catalog? In case where this metadata, values for metadata comes from controlled vocabularies, it's very important to establish and govern this controlled vocabularies, how you're going to talk about licenses, how you're going to talk about frequency, how you're going to talk about quality, what are the topics, subjects, etc., how you're going to tag those resources. And then you need to decide on your cataloging processes. So I showed the type of cataloging that could happen automatically. Well, you just provide a spreadsheet, and automatically a system could figure out information about it from the spreadsheet itself. That is automatic capture of technical metadata. But you could have additional metadata. You could have some contextual business and operational metadata. And some of it could also be captured automatically because it depends on how the data asset is made available to the catalog. So instead of me going and clicking and just submitting a data set, maybe some kind of a business process is submitting a data set for cataloging. In this case, you have some surrounding metadata, perhaps what process is using the data set, and some other broader context that you could make available through the APIs to the catalog. And then there is a role of people that have various responsibilities for caring about the catalog, and what processes do they use to enrich information in the catalog. And then when you have the catalog created, you will test it with users, and invariably you will iterate, extend the available information, maybe add additional data sources. And this is essentially a virtual cycle, because your catalog is really never complete. Data in the organization grows, use cases for using the data also grow, and the catalog will be continually extended and enriched. One part of the enrichment is this connection between the data elements and business glossaries, because business glossaries in the enterprise provide semantics about the data elements in the data catalog, which is very important. We actually had a whole webinar recently exactly on that topic, as to how you could connect the data elements, such as age category, to a business term such as an age group. What are the processes for doing it? What are the possibilities for doing it? Which could be done manually, could also be done automatically. And here you have a link for this webinar that may be of interest on this particular topic. And one other topic that I want to touch on quickly is the whole topic of APIs. So the statistical data catalog is a good example of reach available APIs, and a very extensive documentation on APIs. So if you go there, you'll see some available endpoints. You see information on fields that are available through APIs. And you see even more, full documentation, how you could use those APIs, example calls, etc. So that's very important, because the APIs interact with data catalogs in two ways. One is the systems can also be catalog users and stakeholders, so they get the available information through APIs. And then in the cataloging process, the systems add information to the catalog. So you need those APIs, not just for read, but you need those APIs for write, and you need to be able to declare the kind of information that you're getting and the kind of information that you're adding to the catalog. So the systems such as TopRightEdge provides actually highly capable and open APIs, which are based on standards. And you could take a look at this blog that describes how you could both read information in TopRightEdge and write information to TopRightEdge, both at the data level and at the metadata model level. And we also had some recent webinar that kind of touched on this topic, expanding more on the use of the knowledge graphs, but from with a strong API focus that you may be interested in. And with this, hopefully we've described and demonstrated why knowledge graphs are important for data cataloging specifically, and for data governance in general, as this flexible, highly capable platform for crossing the silos, crossing different data silos, connecting information, making it available to the users. And we probably have some questions, and let me turn to Christy to see what questions.
Thanks, Irene. We do have a couple of questions, and if you haven't already, please go ahead and submit any questions you may have in the question box located on the right-hand side control panel. We'll go ahead and answer those today if we have time. If not, we'll do a follow-up. If you're ready, we'll go ahead and see what we do have. Irene, here's one. Should one rely on data catalogs that are already included with other types of tools, such as ETL software?
Okay, well, that's a very interesting question, because increasingly when you look at ETL tools such as Informatica, Talent, and others, you see some data cataloging capabilities that a part of that product. And you could understand why it's the case, because as data gets processed, you have this rich information that I've talked about, lineage and transformation, etc. It's available in those tools, and therefore it could be made available to the catalog. The issue with this approach is that enterprises have many tools available to them, and no matter what tool you're talking about, there's going to be some other tools and that are used in the enterprise. So you may be using Informatica for some ETL, or you may also having some custom scripts, custom programs for other ETL. Or in another part of the organization, you may be using Talent, or you maybe have some unstructured data sources that go through completely different type of processing. So the importance of the data catalog is that it's intended to cross the silos and provide you a unified point of entry to find all the data in the enterprise, this sort of a map of them all that I've mentioned. And if you keep the data catalog to just a specific point tool environment, then you're just creating yet another data silo. I mean, it provides you a catalog within that environment, but it doesn't give you this broader access to all the data that you may have in the organization now and will have in the future. So a true data catalog should really be more of a standalone that can cross those different silos as opposed to being embedded in a particular ETL or a data lake type of a product.
Great, thank you, Irene. Let's go to the next question. What is the difference between data cataloging and metadata management?
Well, it's an interesting question. Obviously, they are very connected. So I talked through this throughout this presentation. I've talked about metadata, and I've talked about controlled vocabularies that provide values for different types of metadata. So in order to have a data catalog, you need to engage in the metadata management, because that's a way to uniformly describe assets in the catalog and provide this kind of a governance layer. So the metadata management is very important for data cataloging, and it's a broader umbrella, and you could say that the data governance is even a broader umbrella than that encompasses roles, responsibilities, processes, issue management, etc. And all of that is necessary in order to have truly usable data catalogs that are needed for organizations.
Okay. Great, thank you, Irene. I think we'll go ahead and wrap up today's webinar. Thank you, Irene and Robert, for your time. There were a couple of questions that we weren't able to get to that we will follow up on via email, as well as a link to the recorded presentation and slides. So thank you, everyone, for your attention and interest in today's topic, and we hope you have a wonderful day. Thank you.